Hello. I just want to welcome you to a class, actually, that I've been doing here in the Northland of Minnesota. My name is Doug Hardt, and I'm the Seventh-day Adventist pastor for the Iron Range Churches of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I've been doing a class on Islam. Now, why Islam? We're going to look at that here in a minute. But first of all, we're going to look at Islam today, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of my experience with Islam and why I felt a need to do a class like this. So we're going to have multiple videos that you can listen to and try to understand really the history of this 1,400-year-old religion. So we're going to look at Islam today, and that's the Islam I've come in contact with. I was born in Grand Island, Nebraska, raised in Hutchinson, Minnesota. And up until the time I was 30, I don't think I knew one Muslim in the world. I went to college, was working here as a pastor in California and Colorado. And it really wasn't on my radar screen. But when I was about 30, I got invited by our church to go overseas and work in the Caucasus, which is Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And I'll put a picture up on the screen. You can see it's right in between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And Azerbaijan was a predominantly Muslim country, about 98%, 99% Muslim. And we ended up living in that territory for a total of about 7 years. So I got very acquainted with many Muslims, and I have a picture there of when we were living in a town called Ganja out in western Azerbaijan. And that was a wedding that was done in our church. But all these people were at one time Muslims themselves. It's a beautiful country. You can see the territory there, mountainous. But they were right next door to Armenia, and they were having a dispute over this part of the land, that picture in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. It's called Nagorno-Karabakh. But everywhere I went, and when we lived in Azerbaijan, you'd hear 5 times a day the call to prayer. And here was the mosque there in the center of Ganja, where we would go on walks. And it was very interesting noting the differences between the cultures, because we also lived in Georgia at one time and Armenia. And each country had their own religion. Georgia and Armenia were the first 2 Christian countries, converted in 301 and 337 AD, respectively. And Azerbaijan had been a Muslim country for over 1,000 years. So just crossing the borders, you're crossing not only cultures, but you're changing religions. And I was coming in contact with basically this new religion to me, Islam. Later on, we ended up moving to the Middle East, and even since I've been back here, when ISIS took over Mosul, I went back to Iraq, to Arbil, which is in Kurdistan, in the northeast corner of Iraq, with one of my friends who's in the humanitarian organization, and we were looking at the humanitarian situation there with the refugees that were fleeing from ISIS as they had just taken over Mosul. And I'm going to show you a picture of Arbil there with the main mosque in the center. So this was really the first time I'd been in the center of what was predominantly a Muslim conflict and a local political conflict there in Iraq. Just some pictures of the history. Here's some of my friends standing by a television station there. Actually, the local television station, which looked like the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. There in the right-hand corner, you'll see one of the refugee camps, comprised of predominantly Muslims that had been chased out of their homes by other Muslims as well. So how many Muslims are there in the world? There are, according to some sources, and nobody knows exactly for sure, but up to 1.7 billion people on the planet are part of the Muslim, what they call Ummah, or community. And so throughout this class, we'll use that word Ummah. It means the Muslim community as a whole. I'm living in Minnesota right now. If you're joining us from outside of Minnesota, that's great. But right now, roughly 1% of our population is also Muslim, predominantly from Somalia. Many refugees, starting in the 1990s, have come here. So now 1 out of every 100 people here in Minnesota as well are Muslims. So it's one reason why it's so pertinent to study this topic, because now not only is it a theoretical studying of a world religion, but it's also studying of a religion of somebody that could be living right next door to you, especially if you live in the Twin Cities or St. Cloud or other areas where they've congregated. So where do Muslims live? Let's just look at that. There are approximately 10 million in North America, between Canada and the U.S. and some of the islands there. There are a couple million in Latin and Central America. At the time I have this graph up, there are about 10 million in the European Union. That's actually gotten larger since this graph was printed. Turkey has over 60 million. In the Arab League, there are 284, approximately, probably up to 300 million. Sub-Saharan Africa also has 250 million. Afghanistan, 22 million. Iran has over 65 million. Azerbaijan and the other stans, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, etc., they have almost 50 million. India has 133 million. Pakistan and Bangladesh have 230 million. China, this might surprise some of you, has over 100 million Muslims living there, 130-some million. And Southeast Asia has another 30 million. And Indonesia, actually the largest Muslim country, has 196 million, up to 200 million Muslims around there. Also Russia has over 26 million Muslims. So why do I show that slide? I'll go to the next slide. And you can see where the density, what the density is of the Muslim world. You can see in the West, North and South America, it's not such a densely populated religion. But if you look in North Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, and then parts of Southeast Asia are very densely populated. But you have to remember, the greatest number of Muslims live outside of the Middle East. And sometimes we equate being an Arab or being a Muslim with being an Arab, which isn't the case at all. You can see from this graph that Muslims are spread out all around the globe, and they're moving more and more. What are the major languages of Muslims and the number of their speakers of these languages? Well, Arabic has over 200 million people that speak Arabic. Malay or Indonesian, over 175 million. Bengali, 171 million. Urdu, around 100 million. Persian or Farsi, 61 million. Turkish, about 60 million. Swahili, 40 million. And Kurdish, over 25 million. So you can see the major languages of Muslim speakers are varied throughout the world. And actually Arabic speakers, yeah, there are the most of them. But really, if you look at it, they're not the majority by any means of the Muslim population. So what are some observations as we look at the Muslim world, things that affect Islam today? And we'll get into this in the class as we look at the history of Islam, as we look at the Quran, and as we look at modern day issues. As I mentioned before, the first thing we notice is that it's worldwide. It's not just in the Middle East, but it's heavily concentrated in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. But Africa and Asia have large numbers of Muslims. What's also interesting, the second thing we notice, is that many Muslims live in religiously plural societies, such as India, China, Sudan, of course, Christian Sudan has just separated the Christian part of Sudan, South Sudan. Lebanon is a religiously plural society, Nigeria, etc., etc., and especially now as Muslims are moving into Europe and America. And this affects Islam today. The third thing we notice is that most Muslim nations are former European colonies and have faced or are facing at the present time economic and social turmoil. So when we look at that map and you look at how many of those places were at one time under colonial rule of some European power, there are a lot of them, which also affects the current face of Islam today, more so than just the religion, but also the political, the social, the economic situation in those countries, in predominantly Muslim countries. As I mentioned before, a lot of times people equate being Muslim with being an Arab. And that just really isn't accurate, that's why we show that map. There are around roughly 300 million Muslims that can be considered Arabs. But you have to remember, out of 1.7 billion, that's only roughly 20% of all Muslims are Arabs. So the vast majority of Muslims are not Arabs. Now, Muhammad was from the Arabian Peninsula. The Quran is in Arabic. And Mecca is the center in Saudi Arabia of the Muslim world, of the Islamic world. So Arabs have an outsized influence, or oversized influence, on the Muslim world. But you have to remember, most people in America are somewhat surprised when they find out 20 million of the Arabs are actually Christians. Between Egypt and Lebanon and other parts of the Gulf, there are millions of Arabs who are not Muslims. They are actually Christians and have been Christians for centuries. So just to equate being a Muslim with being an Arab, or being an Arab with being a Muslim, is not completely right, because there are many. The majority of Muslims are not Arabs, and there are some Arabs who are not Muslims. We will look later in the class at the difference between the Sunnis and the Shias, but just for now we'll look at the divide, and I'll put up a graph here that you can see. This is the divide between the Sunnis and the Shias, and roughly 80% of the Muslim world is Sunni, roughly 20% is Shia. And you can see where the Shias are located. Basically, the whole Muslim world is Sunni, with the exception of some parts of Afghanistan. The two main governments that are Shia in nature are Iranian, or the Iranian government, and Azeri, or in Azerbaijan government, where I used to live. Those are the only two, really, what you would consider Shia countries, that the predominant population. Now, Iraq has a large number of Shias, and actually they are now predominant, but for instance, when Saddam was ruling, he was Sunni. And that, hence, part of the issue now in Iraq between Sunnis and Shias. There are pockets of Shias in Yemen, parts in Syria, which Bashar al-Assad and the conflict that's going on there now is in great deal due to that Shia-Sunni divide, because Assad's tribe is only 12% of the population there, and it's a Shia tribe. The majority of Muslims there are Sunni. And then you have Lebanon and Turkey with a few pockets, but other than that, the rest of the world is part of Sunni Islam. And we will look in this class, because most people here in the West, they know the names, they know there's a difference, but they're not exactly sure what. And you might be in that situation as well. So some of the Islamic rituals, the azan or adhan is the call to prayer. This is probably, if you go to a Muslim country, if any of you who are watching have been to a Muslim country, this is the one thing everybody notices. This is the call to prayer 5 times a day. I've been in different places. I remember Egypt, about 5 o'clock in the morning. All across the whole village where I was staying, about 8 different mosques had the azan at different times, and it was a cacophony of noise, but that's something that is just so equated with Islam that, this is one thing that when you go to a Muslim country really stands out. Most people here in the West, unfortunately, know Allahu Akbar, which means God is the greatest, from terrorism. But this is actually part of the prayers and call to prayer, that God is the greatest, and many Muslims and actually even Arab Christians use this term, and unfortunately the terrorists have taken to, or Islamic armies, when they end up killing their enemy, cry out this, and this is what we see and hear a lot in the West. But that's what it means, God is the greatest. Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah is what is called the Shahada, which is I testify that there is no God but God. And then it goes on, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and I testify that Muhammad is the prophet, or the messenger, the one sent by God. So again, this is something that is a base of Islam. We'll look at the 5 pillars of Islam here in a minute. But this is something that you will hear, if you study anything about Islam. One of the things when I would take groups, because I ended up teaching a class on Islam, and actually this is a a condensed version of that class at a college in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we would go to the mosque or the masjid. And masjid means place of worship. The actual word mosque is related to the word mosquito from Spanish, when Ferdinand and Isabella said they would get rid of all the mosques in Spain when they reconquered Spain for Christianity, and chase out all the Jews and Muslims out of Spain. But they said we were going to get rid of the mosque like mosquitoes. So it's not exactly a real positive term. Masjid actually means a place of worship. So if you go to the masjid or mosque, usually remove your shoes, actually all the time. I don't think I've ever been to a masjid where we don't remove shoes, which signifies the holy. So again, these are just some things in Islamic ritual. If you go to a masjid, if you go to a Muslim country, you will notice. So what are the 5 pillars of Islam? Well, the first one is the one we just talked about, the confession of faith, the Shahada, which is, you're saying that there's one God and that there's no other gods except the one God, and that Muhammad is his messenger. This is kind of the entrance into Islam. If you say this, this means you're coming into Islam. I've put also, by the way, the Arab terms, because really, talking to Muslims all around the globe, the Arab terms really have stuck because of the Quran, because of Muhammad being from Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula. So just so you know the actual Arab words as well as what it actually stands for. Salat is the prayer. These are the 5 daily prayers that they offer. Zakat is almost like a tithing system, a charitable giving, where 2.5%, and I've heard different ways of calculating it. Could be income from a year, maybe it's of your total wealth. There are different ways of calculating it, but in any case, it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. You give 2.5% of your either profit, what you've gained, or your total wealth. Fasting, which they call Saum, which we know as Ramadan, the 1 month of fasting a year, where all Muslims from sunup till sundown do not drink water or eat anything. And this happens for a full month. And it varies from year to year. It's based on the lunar calendar, so each year you can look online and find out when that's going to be. Sometimes it's in the middle of summer, sometimes it's the beginning, end. But it's something that all Muslims do around the world, and it unifies Muslims anywhere you go. The 5th one is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And at least once in your life, as a Muslim, you're supposed to make this Hajj. There's the greater Hajj and the lesser Hajj. If you go, there's a certain time of year when they do the greater Hajj, where millions of people, which I believe this picture that I have up there is actually from that time. And you go and see the holy sites. You go to the great mosque and the Kaaba, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And it's just part of being a Muslim at least once in your lifetime. Now, some Muslims that I know say, yeah, you only do that when you can, if you have enough money after taking care of the needs of your family and the people around you, if, like poor people in your mosque or masjid. And so some people might never go on, and if you're poor, there's just no possible way to go, and you can still be a Muslim without going if you just can't. I'm going to put up the Arabic of the Al-Fatiha, which is the beginning of the Quran. The Quran we'll talk about in a later lecture. It's actually 114 surahs or chapters, so I will refer to them in this class as a surah, which is a chapter. And it starts off with the famous Arabic phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most merciful and the most gracious. And this is the one that a Muslim, when they are saying the 5 prayers a day, actually recites this prayer 17 times. And I'll translate it in English. In the name of God, the most merciful and the most gracious, may praise be to the Lord of the universe, the most merciful, the most gracious, the master of or king of the day of judgment. You we worship, and to you do we seek your aid or your help. Lead us in the right way, the way of the righteous, the way of those who you have grace on, and not those who incur your wrath and those who go astray. So this is the basic prayer, a very general prayer to the one God, which is in Islamic understanding the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Ishmael, and that He will lead them in the right way, and that He will they will go in the way where they have grace upon Him, and He's the most merciful and the most gracious. So this is the foundation of Islam, is that a gracious and merciful God who leads His people in the right way, and they do not incur His wrath. That's kind of the introduction. Because we're condensing this class that I did in Nebraska, we'll now move into the next section of this presentation, which we're going to look at what was the Arabian Peninsula like before Islam. Because if we're going to understand Islam, those were just the basics. That's just the overall general view. But in this class, we're going to go a bit deeper. If you watch a 15-minute video, for instance, on the history of Islam, or if you watch these clips of where people are saying, this is the way Islamic history was, this is what Islam stands for, you can't really do that in 5 minutes. You can give, already, I've spent over 20 minutes just giving a general overview, but that's nothing really specific. So if we're really going to understand Islam, which this class is all about, is really trying to understand what is Islam, what has been the history of Islam, what are some of the challenges that Islam faces, how is Islam related to Christianity and Judaism and other religions, why are there Sunnis and Shias, where did terrorism come from, why is terrorism such a huge thing now in the Islamic world. And really this class couldn't be more pertinent because we're seeing things on a daily basis now in the news about Islam. There are many voices out there about it. So I really hope you're going to stick with us as we go through this class, because really when you think about it, 1.7 billion people, that is 1 out of every 5 people on this planet is a Muslim. So chances are, no matter where you live almost, I remember I was driving through Nebraska, western Nebraska a few years ago to Lexington, a fairly small town out there, and I came across a Somali community center in the middle of Nebraska, where kind of the area where I grew up. And back when I was living in Nebraska in the 1970s, that's something you wouldn't have found. So I do believe it's important. We're going to go a bit deeper. We're going to look in the next part of this presentation at actually the pre-Islamic Arabian culture and political situation, because I think you will see by the end of the class just how much that actually has left its imprint on Islam. So first of all, the first thing we need to notice is here's a Google map picture of the Arabian Peninsula. The darker spots would be spots that have some type of vegetation. The lighter spots are just actually vast open desert. I remember flying from Amman, Jordan to Kuwait, which would be just across the top portion of that, very top of that map, over to the top of the Persian Gulf there you see on the right. And I flew for 2 hours, which is like, flying almost from Denver to Minneapolis or even a little bit further. And you're just flying there, and I was looking out the window, and all I could see, because I like sitting by the airplane window, and I just looked outside, and all you can see there is one little road with a gas station, maybe every 50 to 100 miles, and that was it. The rest was sand. In fact, there was sand in the air. It was just this vast abyss, basically, of sand. So when we're talking about the beginning of Islam, this is really the center of it, which is from the Hijaz, and we'll look at it in a different map, which is on the left side of the western side of the Arabian Peninsula there, as you're looking at it. And it's 900,000 square miles of, for the most part, very rough terrain. And some of it is just absolutely almost the most desolate portion of the planet. So it's an absolutely huge territory. And the next map I'll just show a modern day map, and you can see Mecca there on the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, there by Jeddah, and then you have Medina about 150, 200 miles to the north, which those are the two most holy sites of Islam. you can see there's Riyadh out there, kind of in the middle of the desert. But really, after that, there's just not there's not much to speak of when you talk about the Arabian Peninsula. So that does play a part, as we look at what was going on the Arabian Peninsula, what was happening before Islam came in. And for the most part, they were shepherds, they were pastoralists. And, they were trying to, here's a painting actually of a European in the 1800s, because their way of life really hadn't changed a whole lot. They were nomads, the Bedouins, we call them Arabs now. They loved poetry. We call it qasida in Arabic. And the poets were the unofficial spokesman for the tribes. And since they were also traders, they would move around a lot. And that was the way they left their history, was telling people around the campfire, for instance, and creating poetry in the Arabic language. And they were very tough people. You just have to be tough. I mean, if you look at the Arabian Peninsula, there's no way that, if you look at most empires, the Roman Empire, Babylon, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, I mean, most empires just kind of left it alone. I mean, it was just this vast abyss of nothingness. So to think that there are these people out there roaming around trying to make a livelihood for themselves out in the middle of this desert, it's really quite remarkable, really, to think about. So what was in their culture? Basically, they were a very humanistic, tribal humanistic culture. The chief of virtues was murua, which is manliness. And, obviously it was a male-dominated society, and the males were kind of the ones that had to provide and keep protected their families, their tribe. And since it was such a harsh environment, as I mentioned, you just had to be tough. And so toughness or manliness and being a good warrior, being brave, and it was an honor-based culture as well. So you're trying to bring honor to your tribe, to your family. You had to be courageous. Loyalty to the clan was very much part of this culture, and that at all costs you were loyal, you honored the tribe and brought honor to it. Generosity was also part of the culture. Sexual prowess was part of this manliness. And for the most part, people were hedonistic and pessimistic about the afterlife, and even the heroic in their stories was tinged with the tragic. So much so that the Muslims today consider this the Jahiliyyah, that is the days of ignorance in Arabic. So they viewed this as kind of a rough time, a hedonistic time, where you just live for the life, you're as manly as you can be, you fight, in which the Arab tribes were known for fighting amongst each other, raiding each other's caravans, and trying to bring your tribe into prominence. So, what kind of government was there? Well, actually, there were some crowned kings on that peninsula in Yemen, Hira, and Ghassan. But for the most part, it was tribal chiefs and leaders sprinkled throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And in theory, all of the tribes there claimed allegiance to the kings, and those kings to the different empires. And I'll show you a map here in a minute. The Persian Empire or to the northeast, or the Byzantine Empire to the northwest. And interestingly enough, leaders were elected by the whole tribe, so it was somewhat democratic. And there was much rivalry involved between the clans for selecting leaders. So even within the tribe, you had the different families that would try to get together and, basically do a campaign for somebody from their tribe to be, or their clan to be the leader. And the leaders were allowed spoils of war, a quarter of the spoils of war, and many privileges, and became almost dictators once they were elected. So this is just kind of what was going on. You had two big empires, which I'll show a picture or a graph here of. And you can see there on the graph, you have the Persian Empire, which is called the Sassanid dynasty, or Sassanid Empire, sometimes in history books. And then you had the Eastern Roman, which since Constantine had moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, the present-day Istanbul, that became the headquarters of the Christian Empire, which you can see spread through the Balkans and Greece, Macedonia, and then parts of Italy and North Africa and the Middle East. And then so you had these two large empires, and then you had the Ghassanids, which were a proxy for the Byzantines. They're just below where the purple is, and then you have the Lakhmids right below the Persians, which in that part of Arabia were a proxy government for the Persians. And then you had all the different tribes. You had some form of government in the southern part there of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen and Mahra and Azd Oman, or what is now Oman, and part of United Arab Emirates. And these were all Persian vassals. So you had the different tribes which had to decide, who are you going to be with on the Arabian Peninsula? And you can see the two big empires were really the ones that were fighting for preeminence, and everybody kind of had to decide, who are you going to be friends with. So what was their religion? Interestingly enough, the Arabs had a tradition that they had worshipped the God of Abraham and Ishmael. And the word Allah, which is somewhat controversial here in the West, but just in Arabic it's from the word ilah, which then you add the article to, so it's the God. It's Allah then in the Arabic language, so it just means the God. It's some people say it's a moon god, it's not the real God. However, that's only a problem here in the West. Over in the Middle East, for instance, all the Christians refer to that same God as Allah. Nobody really fights over the word. It's only here in the West where we do that. And considering we use the word God in English, which used to be a Germanic god, Gote, we've adopted that word and made it our word, and nobody that goes to a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue thinks that they're worshiping Gote, this Germanic god, from hundreds of years ago. So anyway, they believe that Allah was the one God, but they had added many gods, and each tribe chose which gods to serve. And some were intercessors to Allah on their behalf. And in fact, at the time of Muhammad and a little bit before him, the Kaaba there, and we'll look at that here in a minute, had 360 gods of the Arabs. So they had gone from 1 to 360. And actually the three main gods of Mecca were actually goddesses, and they were Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. And these were the three main protecting gods of Mecca. They had basically three rituals that were associated with the worship of their gods: animal sacrifice, circumambulation, that is circling of the holy sites, and making pilgrimages. And by the way, Mecca was the main center of pilgrimage because the 360 gods of the Arabs were located in this one house. And it's interesting because if you look at polytheism in general, most of the polytheistic gods somewhat tend to be fairly devious like human beings are, and the Arab gods were no different. They were pretty vulgar, committed adultery, stoning each other, having fights, contention. So if you look at the religion, it had gone from, because historically the Arabs had said that Abraham had come one time to the Kaaba and had actually made a sacrifice to his God, which, according to Christians and Jews is, the Jews, Yahweh, or what we call Jehovah sometimes, the one God of Abraham. And the Kaaba was this place where the Arabs would come, and it was a historical site of where Abraham had been with Ishmael, offered to the one God, but they had now put in 359 other gods into this black box. And you can see that black box there. That's actually what the word means, or cube. Actually, Kaaba means cube in Arabic. And they would come there and they would circle that site. They would make that pilgrimage to Mecca, and all the different tribes had different gods and goddesses that were their protectors, gods of wind, fire, war, procreation, whatever it might be. There was the God, Allah, but he was just one of kind of this pantheon of gods. But the Kaaba had this historical significance because of Abraham and Ishmael. And so the Arabs had basically, since the Arabs were the descendants of Ishmael, and Muhammad was in the direct lineage of Ishmael, still had this tradition, and that's why Mecca is Mecca, because of the historical tie to Ishmael and Abraham. So that's kind of the historical foundation, the backdrop, which becomes very important as you're studying the Quran, and especially some of the statements in the Quran about Allah, God, the God of Abraham. Another interesting thing about the culture of Arabia at that time is just how women were treated. And basically women, because of Muruwa, because of this, men were the dominant ones. If the man rose to power, that was kind of became the tribal chief. That was the ultimate goal. And to be courageous, to be brave, to provide. And basically women were in the background. They were treated more as property. A man would get one to own one and to take care of her and protect, help protect the tribe. Well, because of that, when a daughter was born, that wasn't always so popular. Why? Because obviously the men were in charge, the men were protecting the tribe. So there was actually a practice of female infanticide. That is, they would take their baby girls when they were born at times. Obviously they had to keep some. But they would just bury them alive in the sand. And this was well known, and we know it especially because the Quran refers to it and actually forbids this practice. So marriages were they were arranged. There were very few rights as far as rights for divorce, for filing for divorce, for inheritance and whatnot. Now what's interesting is Muhammad married Khadija. This was his first wife. And she was an example of, by his time, a woman who had done fairly well financially. So she actually kind of ran a trading business. And she had become pretty wealthy and powerful. She was 15 years his elder, and ended up proposing to him. And so she was, but probably an exception as you look at the culture of the time. But it was possible. So we do see that, it probably wasn't quite as primitive as we might make it out to be in the West. So let's just talk about the Mecca and the Quraysh. Mecca, you probably are aware of Mecca at least. And the Quraysh you probably aren't. Unless you've studied Islam. The Quraysh was actually the tribe of Muhammad's. It was Muhammad's family. And they historically had been in Mecca. They were the keepers of the Kaaba. And so they were the ones that were actually taking care of it, which is why Mecca was special. There were three things that made Mecca special. And I've mentioned this previously. Number one, it had an important religious shrine, the Kaaba, where everybody would come to. Number two, exactly that. It was the destination of annual pilgrimages to this shrine. And number three, it was ruled by an elite tribe, the Quraysh, who controlled the trade and economic political situation connected with the religious shrine. This is incredibly important because the vast majority of the Quran is recited, that's what the Quran means, to the Quraysh, to the tribe of Muhammad. So when you're reading the Quran and you're tempted to think, he's probably talking to Christians and Jews and other people here in the West. No, the vast majority of the Quran was recited as many times warning, as exhortation to the Quraysh tribe. Now there are some of the surahs and a few of the verses, or what they call in Islam ayats, that are dedicated to Christians and Jews, but they're in a very small minority compared to how many are recited to the Quraysh. So were there Christians and Jews on the peninsula, fellow monotheists, at the time of Muhammad and before Muhammad? Absolutely. Here's a map, a graph. There was a significant Christian presence in Najran. If you look at the very bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, Najran there, that was very heavily Christian. And actually, one of the ayats of the Quran deals with them and actually praises the Christians of Najran. And which is interesting, some of the times when it's talking to Christians, and if you read in the English interpretation of the Quran. It'll say to the Christians something da 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 da, when actually it says there in the Arabic to the people in Najran. So we're going to get into that somewhat. What may have been, that's a thing that because of the culture there weren't any libraries on the Arabian Peninsula at this time where they were saving all their records and recording things. Things were passed down verbally through poetry. So the Quran, when you're studying the Quran and when you're studying Islam, you almost have to work backwards from the Quran many times, or try to go off of the scant historical documents we have surrounding that time period. There were probably more Jews than Christians, it appears, on the Arabian Peninsula, up to 20 communities, especially in and around what's called Yathrib or Al-Madinah. And you can see Medina there in the center, western central part of the Arabian Peninsula. And Al-Madinah just means the city, actually, in Arabic. And we know that there were tribes there because they ended up inviting Muhammad from Mecca up to Medina to be their mediator, and we'll get into that in another presentation. But we do know around the Arabian Peninsula there were many Jewish communities and there were a few Christians. Now, the Jewish communities probably had sprung up because Jerusalem had been destroyed in 70 AD, about 500 years previous to that, and there was this kind of dispersing of the Jewish community around the world, including the Arabian Peninsula, and there was this Jewish diaspora there. Now, some of the Christians were probably there because by this time the Christian empire had developed a very strict orthodoxy, and anybody that didn't believe according to what the church was teaching, which there were no denominations as we have today, over 20,000 denominations, there was the government church, and this is just Christianity. This is what we believe, and if you didn't, a lot of times you had to actually flee the whole empire, and many of the dissident groups probably ended up on the Arabian Peninsula as well, and which should influence the way we look at some of the verses or ayats that were given in the Quran. So what does this have to do, going into all the background behind this? Well, what is the legacy of the Arabian culture and the Arabic language on Islam? And here are three things. Number one, classical Arabic. If you read, it's called Fusa. If you read the Quran, basically the classical Arabic, because in the Arab world, which stretches all the way across north from the west end of North Africa, all the way to Iraq in the east, you have very different dialects. In fact, I've talked to my Iraqi friends and they say they can barely understand somebody from Morocco, for instance. It's just so different. There's a French component to their language, and just it's difficult for them to even understand one another, even though they're technically speaking the same language. But if you listen to a news broadcast or you go to a mosque and you read the Quran, the classical Arabic, which is still intact, is the Arabic from pre-Muhammad and pre-Islam on the Arabian Peninsula. So that has left of the legacy. Basically, the Quran and Islam has retained that classical Arabic for 1,400 years almost. And that's one of the legacies of Islam has lingered from the Arabian Peninsula. The second one is the geographical orientation, the Qibla. That's the direction of prayers. And every Muslim in the world, I even have an app on my phone. When I was teaching the class in Lincoln, I bought an Islamic app, and I can find anywhere in the world. I can just point my phone and it tells me exactly which is the closest way to Mecca. And that's the way any Muslim in the world, wherever you're at, you can pray towards Mecca. Now, interestingly enough, the Qibla, or the direction of prayer, used to be towards Jerusalem at the beginning of Islam. But it was changed, and we'll get into that. The third thing is tribal genealogy and tribal rivalry. Now, this is one thing that actually in early Islam Muhammad tried to get away from this. But for instance, the tribal rivalry, the avenging of a murder, kind of that honor shame. If you shame me, I've got to shame you back to get back so that we're equal. And kind of looking out for the tribe and having a collective mentality. This is also part of Arabian culture that has basically become a legacy in Islam. And Islam actually now somewhat replaced the tribe with the religion. But from time to time you see that same old tribal rivalry springing up, for instance, in the Sunni Shia is probably the best example of that. But that way of collective thinking, the way of tracing your genealogy, which every Muslim leader then ended up trying to prove that he was part of the Quraysh and related to Muhammad. And that's part of the Arab culture. And I think that's it for this lecture. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. We're going to get into next time looking at some of the situation that was surrounding Christianity actually at the time, and Judaism, and the religious landscape of the Arabian Peninsula. And then we'll actually get into the life and the ministry of Muhammad. So if you've enjoyed this, stick with us, and you can go now to the next video and continue on as we continue on our journey into understanding Islam.